Dr. Nick Barratt. Nick is a historian, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He's an author, and his most recent book is called The Restless Kings. It's about Henry II and Henry II's sons, Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland, King John. But he's probably best known as a broadcaster, and many of you may recognize his face from TV. He was on the BBC's Who Do You Think You Are programme and was the original consultant genealogist for the first few series. And he's still connected with the series, some of the franchises abroad, including Australia. And I was briefly mentioning it to Nick before. I have a particular memory of one of the episodes of the Australian series. There was an Australian celebrity called Scott Cam. Now, I've never heard of Scott Cam, and I suspect you probably haven't, but he's a famous TV presenter. He calls himself a larrikin. He's a chippy, he's a bit of a geezer, but he's also hugely successful and well recognized. Anyway, he was the subject of one of these Who Do You Think You Are's. He's got both Italian and English heritage, but on the English heritage side, he came to England in following that, and it turned out that, and I saw a little clip on YouTube, which is how I knew to watch it, his great-great-grandfather is the same as my great-great-grandfather. So I was able to watch the programme and, of course, get us a march on a whole new range of research that Nick and his team had done. And towards the end of the series, end of the episode, Nick's there welcoming this guy, Scott Cam, who's in his sort of probably mid-60s, a little bit older than me. Nick takes him to the ancestral home where this great-great-grandfather lived, and also tells him the story of this man who was, rags to riches to rags again. He became a celebrated local horse dealer and did well, and then he ended his days in the workhouse, and Nick was the person who was explaining to this rather bruiser-type chippy about the realities of his own family history. But fascinating. Anyway, so if you ever get a chance to see some of the series, they're still going on, and you can watch them. Nick's now based at Royal Holloway, but he wears many hats. And tonight he's going to be talking to us about family history, the future of family history, the future of local history, the future of community history, and how they all go together. So please welcome Dr. Nick Barratt. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That episode could have ended very differently if he hadn't have been so accommodating with the revelation about his ancestors, which is always the risk, isn't it, when we go digging for information about either our relatives or indeed the place where we live. So there are some lessons learned. What I want to talk about tonight, though, is less about the past, but more about where we're heading next. And I've deliberately rephrased the exam question, if you like, to think about what we do in the digital age. And it's a talk of two halves. The first is admittedly a bit dystopian. Some of the challenges that we face and that are posed by the very rapid change in the way that we research and communicate, which stretches back for the best part of 20 or so years. Not just the rise of Who Do You Think You Are, which, as we'll explore, provides a different take on the motivation of research and also challenges what we do and why we do it. But also the rise of the internet and various key moments over that last 20-year period. But before we do, I just want to go back a little bit further to give you some of the context of how family and local history have always been intertwined. And there are some key dates which I think allow us to think a little bit about how accessible our research and our methodologies are. Now, one of those first key dates is 1484. A little bit of a history quiz. Who knows what happened in 1484? End of the Wars of the Roses? Nearly. Henry VII? We're in the right sort of period. 1484 is slap bang in the middle of the reign of Richard III. Now, he may or may not have murdered the princes in the Tower around about that time. He may or may not have been a dastardly king. But he did one thing that has echoed through the ages, and that was found the College of Arms. Now, he loved his genealogy, and up until that point, it had been predominantly the preserve of the upper aristocracy, particularly those descended from members of the royal family. And of course, given the Wars of the Roses were a very live issue, this had relevance. Who could possibly come along next and claim the throne, as indeed Henry Tudor did by killing Richard at the Battle of Bosworth the following year. But with the College of Arms came a real interest in what was going on locally, not just about the previous aristocratic pedigrees that connected everyone back to the royal family and the royal family back to biblical ancestors, which we often see in episodes of Who Do You Think You Are? But also, what body of evidence was there for some of these claims? Now that's relevant because when you get to the 16th century, you have a real shift in focus. And we're now talking about the dissolution of the monasteries during the reign of Henry VIII. Now, that's an episode of Who Do You Think You Are in its own right. Wanting to get divorced, the Pope refused permission, separates from Rome, another Brexit, and then sets up the Church of England, so he can then divorce Catherine of Aragon. But in doing so, he seized an opportunity to take control of all monastic land in the country. This had been happening for quite a few years before, but this was on an industrial scale. All monastic land was assessed for how much it was worth. The Valor Ecclesiasticus captures all of that information. And then that land was either leased out or sold off. Now, the importance here is that it enabled a new rising class of society to gain access to that status of owning land. Those who had made money out of commerce or trade suddenly bought into the sense of being a major landowner for the first time, enriching the crown, but elevating people who had perhaps been involved in the bureaucratic evidence and work of the government, but also those involved in trade. And they too wanted to have not just the land, but also the status. And this generated a huge interest in their genealogy, trying to find, through earlier pedigrees, a connection with the right to bear arms and put that coat of arms above one's new stately home or mansion built on the profits of that monastic land. So from the 1530s, the College of Arms was kept really busy. The heralds were sent out around the country to check what sort of evidence people had for these claims. And it's fair to say that many of those claims are somewhat spurious, a bit like the internet of the 1530s. A lot of claims were backed up by the herald, possibly with a little bit of money changing hands as well. Yet, of course, all of that information is now at the cornerstone of the College of Arms records and archives, which we now use to grant arms as well. So my point there is twofold. Firstly, more people are interested in tracing their roots. And secondly, they're linking it to land. And as we move through the centuries, 18th century, Society of Antiquaries, 19th century, a renewed focus on local history through the Victoria County histories, we see this interchangeability of tracing the origins of land holding with the status of the people that claimed it, the lords of the manor, for example, manorial descent. It's really when we get to the 20th century that we see the next major phase and widening of access in what we do. We have the Society of Genealogists created in 1911. But it's really the 1970s that sees the popularization of the sorts of local research that we still enjoy and love today. Many family history and local history societies are founded. We also find the widening of access to records, fueled for the first time by television. Gordon Honeycomb's wonderful series about tracing his roots, showing us how to do it, an educational slant, which then creates further popularity. But the reason for tonight's talk isn't just to see this as a continuation of those long trends. It's an acceleration and it's a change. And that's something we need to be really attentive of. Because with the rise of Who Do You Think You Are and the rise of the internet, this is now a mass market, popular, mainstream approach to history, which we should be celebrating. I remember when the first series of Who Do You Think You Are came out 20 years ago, probably the last time you checked the Constitution. Back in 2004, it was described as self-indulgent navel-gazing. as though what we do is dismissed as a bit of a pastime, it's a bit of a hobby, doesn't really add any value to the wider sense of our historical knowledge. Now, I've spent 20 years railing against that, and the irony being on Saturday I gave a talk which is all about my family, which felt very self-indulgent and a little bit navel-gazing. But the point remains, more people now are introduced to the value of researching their roots, whether that is through people or through the place that they live. This is now something that we all are doing and we're all talking about. And I want to explore some of the reasons how this has come about. So this is the first part of my talk, and it is a little bit dystopian. And I'm going to talk through a few consequences of the pandemic. Now, the pandemic obviously highlighted the benefit of online records, because without them, all the digitized content, we wouldn't have been able to access the material that we need to do our research, to a point. But it's also shown us that we can communicate digitally as well. And that's the other great change over the last 20 years. The digital revolution has really changed the way we communicate and share information. If you think back to the great leaps of progress from Egyptians writing on papyrus, to the invention of the printing press in the late 15th century, to mass education in the 19th century, we are now living through unprecedented times. Digital technology is changing the way we work and communicate. And many local societies found that during the pandemic, their way of working, their way of continuing, was to introduce online meetings. Zoom for the first time. Even though today we still start talking and we've gotten to unmute, some of those habits are hard to drop. But it's shown us that we can reach a global audience. Now, as I'll come back to, coming together as people, discussing things, is of fundamental importance to the exchange of knowledge and to our own well-being. But it allowed us to reach global audiences with our areas of local interest, to connect people back. But it's also changed the way we research, because many archives have taken the opportunity to shift the way we access that content. During the pandemic, it was virtually impossible to produce material. It needed to be sanitized and handled carefully. And quite rightly, human safety trumps access to material. But now that our access is opened up again, many archives are requiring us to submit in advance the list of documents we want to see. Now, is that problematic or not? Well, it depends on how you define research. And we'll come back to research versus search in a second. Because when we go out and research, we start with a question that we want to answer. And we think a little bit about the context for that question. And the more we immerse ourselves in local material and understand people's motivations or socioeconomic factors in that area, the more likely we are to find the right material. But even then, it's speculation. We need to look at a wide range of material to get that sense of what's happening. And whilst we rely very heavily on online catalogues, some of what we find is serendipity. Some call it luck. I'm minded at this point of the quote Arnold Palmer is attributed of saying about how he was seen as a lucky golfer. And he said, yeah, of course, it's funny that, isn't it? The more I practice, the luckier I get. And it's a bit like the way we approach our research. Sometimes looking at a document leads us to a line of thought that means we can just move from one thing to the next. Now, if we have to wait a week or 2 weeks to book an appointment and submit those documents in advance, it disrupts research methodology. This is a fundamental shift as a consequence not just of the pandemic, but the rise of the data market. Now, I'm going to be really quite precise and hopefully will offend a lot of people here when we talk about access to records via Ancestry, Find My Past, Family Search, name your platform of choice, as being part of a data market. Because what they have done is provide us with access to content based around the metadata they create, metadata obviously being the description of what that item is. So it's a little bit of text. And they use algorithms, so search codes that match what you put in with that metadata. And then they put it together and you get your results. So that's, very, very generalistic and beginner's guide to algorithms, machine learning, and metadata. Which is why I call it search. You're putting in some information, the algorithms go and match that information with the metadata, and it gives it back to you. That's not research. And increasingly, we are being pointed towards the platforms as the sole source of information. Now, I used to do the Who Do You Think You Are live event, both in London and then Birmingham when it moved for a year or so. And it became increasingly dismaying when I was on the National Archives stand helping out to hear people come up to us and say, "Oh yeah, the National Archives, you're the warehouse that holds Ancestry's records, aren't you?" Because that's the perception. Ancestry have these records and TNA provides access to them. And that's a direct consequence of the financial crash back in 2008, 9, 10, and the age of austerity. And we have to beware of unintended consequences. Like I said, this is a very generalized view, but we have to look at the bigger picture. Now, during that age of austerity, once again, access to records came under threat. Public authorities were forced to make very difficult decisions about where they spent their money. In many ways, something that we're seeing again, post-pandemic, post-Brexit. They had to choose about where to invest, which wages to pay. And quite rightly, you'd say, well, okay, yeah, we need to pay our teachers. We need to pay our hospital workers, our police, our ambulance crews, our firefighters. Absolutely. But the choices were often, well, should we save 2 teachers or 2 archivists or 2 librarians? And sadly, the arts and culture are always a soft target. And they were often the posts to be deprioritized. But with disproportionate impact, there might only be 2 librarians in an area, 2 archivists in a county. So it had a disproportionate impact. And as a result, many archival services were forced to look for new income streams, which meant partnering with these platforms, who would then, at vast expense, digitize and transcribe those records and then provide them on these aggregation platforms. Now, this is great because we get access for a membership fee, obviously, and every time someone looks at an image from an archive, they get money going back in, which allowed them then to subsidize their reading rooms and keep them open. But as we now know over the years, beware of unintended consequences, because now people were looking at those records online, they felt they didn't need to come in person. So it made it even harder to keep the search rooms open unless there was some sort of fantastic and innovative partnership arrangement with a local history society or a family history group. Because what's the point of keeping an empty search room open? As I've just explained, the research requires us to look at the original material. The name-rich data sets have now been commoditized. They're across most platforms. But really challenging, certainly from a genealogy market, they're running out. The next census isn't 1931. That was destroyed. It's not 1941, because it was never taken. The 1939 register, which gives you access to people and where they're living, linked to a whole range of national identity cards and eventually rationing, that's been published. The next census with meaningful household data is 1951, which will come out in 2052. Bit of a gap. What we're now seeing is the National Archives move on to other name-rich collections, which may be of use if you've got a connection, but probably isn't of broader use as things such as census. I'm talking about the Second World War and many of the army service papers. So we're reaching the tail end of these commercially viable data sets. Now, as we'll come on to when we look at some of the machine learning tools and artificial intelligence, noting that it is artificial and it's not intelligent, it may well be possible that if we can teach them to learn some of the handwritten sources and identify them correctly, and by this I'm talking about Latin text as well, we might see a commercial reason to digitize and play through some of those records. You still have to translate them, but of course we've got those tools with us. So I'm not saying it's the end of the line for digitization, but we're going to have to think about what we digitize and why. And at the moment, the commercial platforms are not interested. So as a result, the data market is at a very interesting point, particularly the data records that are provided from state sources. And it's precarious because, as we've seen recently, these are now being seen as targets for cyber criminals. We will all remember the BBL hack that happened a few months ago that will cost millions of pounds to rectify. Many of the catalogues are still offline. Guess what? You have to go in person, just like we used to do. But really importantly, we have to look at the role that these commercial providers play in securing digital access. Many of the British Library digitised collections are no longer available from their servers because they've been corrupted. Newspaper library, for example, the originals are still there, which is fine, but the digital access is now provided solely through Find My Past because the BL's version has been taken offline because of the hack. And there's the lesson learned. Keep that physical archive. I wonder how many people signed the petition to stop the wills being destroyed because we've got digital surrogates. Hopefully people are rethinking that particular call. So the data market is reaching its finite end, but the real richness of researching locally is being hidden because of the platforms that now sit above them. It's a business, and the business is based on volume and our continued interest in the new. So if we're coming to the end of new material, where do we go next? And the answer is user-generated content, which means the stuff that we create and upload to those platforms. So things such as scanned photographs, digitized diaries, stories that we create, family trees that we upload, the stuff that we have researched and are putting on the platforms to aid our research and to help people connect with us. We've reached a tipping point. We reached it a few years ago. Let's take Ancestry, boasting over 5 billion names and growing. Over 52% of those names are generated by us. So that's only going to grow as the amount of state material is fixed. And what the algorithms don't do is do a little bit of quality assurance. How accurate is the material that we are putting up? The old saying, rubbish in, rubbish out. And the more the algorithms find things from user-generated and we adopt them into our trees or our research projects, the more it validates that algorithm. So we're building in inaccuracies every time we do it. Think back to the College of Arms, spurious stuff that we're building and building and building upon. So there's a whole philosophical debate I won't go into tonight, you'll be glad to hear, about the veracity of records, but we need to be really mindful of what we are creating and how we are driving and feeding those algorithms, many of which the coders tell me they've lost control of. That should worry us a little bit. But more importantly, who owns that content? Us or the companies? If you upload a photograph, who owns it? Well, there's a question around, did you have the right to upload that photograph? Did you have the intellectual property? Probably not. So there's an issue there. But once it's uploaded, we lose the right to that content. On the terms and conditions, it's been uploaded in Ancestry, let's say, now own that. Now, there was a bit of a fuss when they changed the rules and regs, and they have consented that if you put something up, you can take it down. However, if someone else has adopted that into their family tree, that surrogate stays, and they can then do whatever they want with it. Now, once again, I'm not saying that we should all take all our stuff off, because that connectivity, that community building is so powerful. But we need to think about who will look after that legacy in years to come, a point I'll come back to. So we've got the data market created by state archives, we've got the stuff we're putting up, and now we've got a third style of data, and that is our DNA. So, quick show of hands. How many people, for the purposes of their research, have done at least one DNA test? A few. If I'd have asked that a few years ago, pretty much no one would have done. Now, the purpose of this is to upload your DNA profile and match you with people sharing some common ancestor who has also done a test. So it's a connective device. And this is now a major area for data growth. We have to be mindful of some of the challenges around that, a point I'll come back to. But it's changing the way we think about those first two categories of data. Personal example. My grandmother was illegitimate and born overseas, and she didn't know the names of either parent. That's a pretty high and solid brick wall to get around with your research. And try as we might, based on the scant information, we found nothing about her. Nothing in any records at all, in this country or in the place where she claimed to have been born. It was only after some extensive DNA testing that we found that there was a connection. And that was based on a chance discovery that someone had put up. It was a baptism record with her name on it, great. And that was a transcription project fueled by funding, looking at the end of the First World War and what happened to Belgian migrants. She'd been born, or so we thought, in Antwerp. Through the database, we found she'd been born in a place called Knock. And we did a bit of research and worked out through the name of the father on the record that she was descended from one of the Mayflower emigrants. Fabulous story. And we did some DNA testing to confirm that with other descendants from similar lines. And what we found was that there was no DNA connection whatsoever, which was really thrilling. However, by looking at the cluster matches on Ancestry, we found the likely real parent and did a bit of research and have now verified that's the link. But here's the point. It's a bit like Schrodinger's family tree. It's both accurate and not accurate at the same time. The written record through the baptism names the father, and that's completely validated through the official sources and the user-generated content. Yet the DNA takes us to a completely different direction. And these are the sorts of compromises, paradoxes, and reconciliations we need to make every time we put stuff online and splice and mash up these data sources. So it's just worth thinking about what we do with this. And now let's throw into the mix the new tools and technologies that generative AI and other sorts of technology are creating. I don't know when any of you have heard of some of the tools that MyHeritage are creating around deep nostalgia. Some very simple tools where you take 20 pictures of yourself and then they show you how you might have looked over different periods of time. But they also have some interesting colorization material, which means you can put in a sepia or black and white photograph and it will colorize it to look like a modern photograph. Now, some of this is really powerful with storytelling, which is what we're all about, right? I'm thinking here of Peter Jackson's film, taken from some of the original material in the Imperial War Museum, which he played for a little bit as this sort of grainy, jumpy, jerky black and white, and then he redigitized it, colorized it, and these people came to life. I don't know whether you saw it a few years ago. It was extraordinary. The first part looked like history. The second part, well, it felt real because we see the world in color, and you could empathize, and you've got that connection. So it's a great storytelling tool, but we have to be really careful. This is a picture of my grandmother, probably about 2 years old, probably when she was in Belgium. With my very limited technical skills, I ran that through a filter, and there she is, looking not like quite a child of the 1950s Pears soap photograph, but not a million miles. It sort of brings them more into the modern age. But here's the real trick, and I'll see if this works. Don't think you can see that. Keep a close eye on what her face does. It's moving and it's blinking. I said that to my mum, who was freaked out, I think it's fair to say. Now, again, bit of fun, isn't it? Or is it? We have to be really careful about where this is taking us, because we're getting to the period where what was science fiction a few years ago is now actuality. Think back to the Hollywood screenwriters and scriptwriters strike. They were worried about the use of generative AI, so this is a piece of sophisticated artificial intelligence that allows you to type something in and it will respond as though it's a person, and it will learn from how you respond and almost talk back to you. It's based on machine learning across the internet. And of course, we all know that there's implicit bias and stuff there that we really don't want to get machines learning on. But that's sort of what it's doing. The scriptwriters were concerned that you could create new scripts without any human getting near. But then with that sort of technology I've just demonstrated, we can see that that could apply to actors. Now, there was a film recently, The Irishman, where using that digital technology, they rejuvenated Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, creating younger versions of themselves using the way they moved and acted. But what you can now do, using generative AI and that same technology, is create completely new scenes based on existing film material over their careers. And you can have that voiced in their own voice because you've now got a sound archive that can be mimicked, replicated, and fed into the generative AI. So in theory, you can take any screen actor or actress that's got some of that sound and moving image and create versions of films that never existed. Again, it's not science fiction. Stephen Fry was rather perturbed to find that there were a series of audiobooks claiming to be him that he'd never narrated. So we're living with these consequences, and we need to be really careful about where we go next, because Up until now, the historic record has been largely static. What we're creating now are the tools to make it malleable and for us to share it and pass it off as real. Now again, philosophical debate, what's real and not real? We'll possibly park that one there. But it's making us think about identity. Excuse me, suffering from a chest infection. I had hoped to get through without any coughs tonight. There we go. That record's gone. And these same tools are creating greater opportunity for identity theft, to mimic us. That content that we put up and the membership subscriptions that we pay based on our personal data are being hacked. 23andMe was a great example. Something like 6,000 user accounts were infiltrated, but several million people were impacted because of the way we connected our family trees, which meant that they got not just our subscription details, but our family relationships, possibly some of that content, so they can mimic us. And at the university at the moment, we're dealing with some really sophisticated cyber criminals who are using this technology now against our students. So that's the dystopian bit. We're now going to look at some more positive things, because a lot of that technology can be used for good. And I want to think a little bit about education. And I've already mentioned one of the great partnerships with higher education, creating that database that allowed me to find my grandmother. But at our heart, we're all storytellers. And those same tools can allow new people to tell stories and do the research and present it in a way that's meaningful to them. So the example I've got there is a project called Making History, which was intended to give people who were eradicated from the state record a voice. The actor Colin McFarlane, who's done a whole range of films and voiceovers, comes from an Afro-Caribbean background. And he was quite blunt. He said, well, at school, it meant nothing to me. I had no connection with these kings and queens and generals and aristocrats and basically a bunch of white folk, he said. So he was really surprised to find when reading a script that one of the first people to the North Pole also had Afro-Caribbean heritage. And he said, well, why don't I know this? This is part of my cultural heritage. So we started to ask around his parents and grandparents, and they wouldn't tell him about what life was like back in the Caribbean. And he thought, I wonder how many young people feel the same way I do. So we created the project Making History, which was basically to get kids to ask questions of parents and grandparents about their cultural heritage, light touch genealogy, light touch community history, but much more about the sense of, well, who do they think they were? And partnering up with a local university and Apple, they were given the tools and training to create films about their experiences. And these were shown at the BFI just after the project had finished. It was incredible. The impact on those young lives, but really importantly, the intergenerational learning. And I should add that this wasn't just about people who had parents and grandparents. It was also people who had started to look at their identity because they were in foster care or wanted to focus on the local area where they had come because they were part of a diaspora story. It opened up the sense that history is for everyone and it means something because of where I'm living now. So that local history was large through all of the stories. And it turned around many of those young lives. There was one chap who was working on the project in Lincolnshire and wanted to find out more about his roots. And on talking to his dad, he was astonished to find out that he had Irish heritage. And he said, well, why didn't you tell me that? I didn't know I was Irish. And his dad looked at him and said, why do you think I called you Liam? It's quite an Irish name, Liam. He said, oh, you didn't know. It turns out that his father had come over when he was a young lad because Liam's granddad was in Londonderry in the 1970s during the height of the Troubles and was working in a bar, and one night one of his friends went outside as the car screeched to a halt and shot him dead. So Liam's granddad thought, oh, I'm going to be next. Packed up all of his worldly goods, including his young son, Liam's dad, drove through the night, got the ferry across, carried on to Lincoln where they stayed with family members, and essentially eradicated that story. Now what Liam did was interview his dad, so there's oral history, but then got the family to go back to the pub and the house and film some of those streets and feelings. So there's a bit of local history. And then he put over some very haunting Irish folk music from the time, talking about the Troubles. So this really personal account was shown to the BFI audience, 3 minutes long. And when the lights came up, people were just wiping the tears away. It was so emotional, but it was so empathetic. Now, excuse me, Liam entered the program because he was struggling at school, and he had real difficulties engaging with higher education and the thought of going to university. He was going to drop out. By the end of this process, he'd learnt new skills and confidence, went to uni, did history and media studies, and is now a very successful, and I believe award-winning, producer. Turned his life around. And that partnership between higher education and public history and storytelling is so important because our stories matter. Our research matters. Without going into a full breakdown of how higher education is funded, a key part of it is the Research Excellence Framework, which gives research-intensive universities funds to do research. But increasingly, they have to demonstrate impact on us. And instead of just using us as guinea pigs or case studies, they're coming to us to co-design the research questions and involve us with that work. So our stories, our research, our material is now critical to most history departments and most research-intensive universities. And we can build those partnerships and get funding and support from them. It's not just about money, though. It's about the impact of those stories and those changes on people's lives. 2 quick case studies. They're not from this area, but there are things there I think we can learn from. The first relates to Stirling Prison. It was a women's prison, and they had a real problem with the rate of reoffending for people who came out after their time was served. So they wanted to do something different about it. And they decided to think about motivation. Why were people not motivated to learn their lesson and do something different? So they ran 2 parallel cohorts, one with vocational training, the usual stuff, and another one that was given some tools and access to the internet in a limited way to research their family history and start to spot patterns of behavior. And as a result, firstly, they understood that those choices they had made weren't predetermined. Lots of other people in their family had made choices that led them to different paths. So there was that sense of cathartic ownership of why they were there. Really important. Secondly, they were able to think about some of the people that inspired them, who had led amazing lives and did some wonderful things. And thirdly, they were able to look at some of the vocational areas that they wanted to focus on themselves. It's like a skill set running through the family. Could they learn similar skills? So they had motivation, we gave them the tools, and the results were quite extraordinary. Of those 2 cohorts, the one without this filter got the same sort of poor response rates in terms of rehabilitation and reoffending. The cohort that we selected had a virtually 0 rate of reoffending because they wanted to be those aspirational characters for future generations. They often worked with youth groups to stop other people making those mistakes. Really quite powerful stuff. Now, of course, that's not going to work for everybody. But if you do spend a bit of time and think about motivation, people will respond. And that element of making it real and personal and empathetic is, again, a key thing that we can all play a part of. We can provide that environment, that information, those skills, that educational purpose in helping different people to come in. Not just because we love doing it and it's wonderful to tell stories, because it really can turn people's lives around. And it can have a ripple effect on the wider community. The next case study is the Ryde Social Heritage Group, Ryde being on the Isle of Wight, the Isle of Wight being a party place throughout most of the summer, as well as a holiday destination. But in the winter it gets quite quiet and, dare I say it, dull. And the local folk, particularly the younger people, were a little bit bored, and there was a particular group who were hanging around the local cemetery, kicking over the gravestones and defacing them. So a heritage group was formed to do a basic monumental inscription project to capture the data before it was gone. It's about 10, 12 years ago. Now, they were given £2,000 by the council to do this, but instead of selling that data on to make a profit on that, they created their own website, put up the data, but also told stories about the people who were there. And that storytelling allowed people from around the world to visit the website, find out more, and then ask questions to the point where many people were coming over to the Isle of Wight to visit, not during the party season, but during the quiet shoulder or off-peak seasons, showing that there was a notable uptick in hotel bookings, restaurant bookings. They were doing guided tours and getting paid for it. There was a real ancestral tourism boost, which could be quantified because it wasn't hidden on another platform. With the result that the council looked at this and then gave them £60,000 to renovate the 2 chapels in the graveyard, one of which became a base for their operations where they could show people around, but then film and capture their stories, continually adding content to that website. And the other one was turned into a graveyard classroom, where the local kids were educated across the entire curriculum. I mean, who wouldn't want to go to a graveyard to learn all your stuff? Great fun, but also really powerful. It wasn't just about, here's the importance of history, and here's the importance of the gravestones. It was about literacy and creative writing. Many of the older children were able to help with some of the technology. They were nature trails, hence that picture there, really great stuff. And as a result, they created an army of volunteers amongst the kids and their parents, that intergenerational learning again, who every year would hold heritage open days. They would put on displays, but they would also go out into the community, using libraries to bring people in, or often going to care home settings where people couldn't get out, and interview them and add more voices to that website. The group is still going strong, and it won the Community Archive and Heritage Group Award for Archive of the Year a few years ago. Really interesting, because it's not just about doing it for ourselves, it's seeing the benefit of doing it for a wider audience. And we found that it created a much younger interest, with maybe different techniques and maybe some of those technical skills coming in, but it really allowed us to think about the purpose of why we exist as societies. But it also got us thinking about what's in it for us. The group had a really important revelation in that they could just do this online and it's fine, but it was the sociability that was so key to making the community come alive. Now, there's a lot of data around the factors that impact mental health, particularly as we grow a bit older. Diet, fitness levels, smoking, alcohol, all the stuff that we sometimes quite like to do. But the thing that is the greatest negative impact is a lack of sociability, a lack of coming together as people. I take you back to the beginning of the talk when I talked about the impact of the pandemic. And society is now often looking at that blended approach. Coming together as people, sharing our stories, sharing our research endeavours in a face-to-face environment boosts our well-being. And that's why groups such as ours exist, to provide that social framework, to help people through that isolation of the pandemic, those heartbreaking stories of people in care homes and their family and loved one not being able to visit them. The amount of damage that did to people's mental health is incalculable, particularly those living with dementia, a point I'll come back to. But it's also taught us the importance of our own legacy management and preparation, keeping our minds fresh, keeping our memories in sequence and order. Again, it is not self-indulgent navel-gazing. It is an important part of keeping our own life stories in order, to create that timeline with what are known as flashbulb memories, something that will trigger it and immediately you're brought back to the moment like a flashbulb. And these are often multi-sensory. So it could be a smell or a perfume. It could be a sound or a song. It could be looking at a newspaper. Where were you when? That common moment where we can all recall where we were when JFK was shot, when Queen Elizabeth passed, all those sorts of things. But the point being is that we should actively manage our legacy content so that we can access it any time we want. It's worth just thinking about how we might want to start when we're younger, keep some of this stuff alive, not just for future generations, but so that we can anchor ourselves in our own timelines. Because one of the challenges, particularly for people living with dementia, is that that becomes harder and harder. And those multi-sensory prompts are really important. And we've found this where people have actually created really strong and really vivid timelines for themselves. It makes it easier for them to reconnect and for people to reconnect with them. So that application is really key. Again, lots of case studies, I'm aware of the time, but I'll give you just one about how powerful our research and our memories are. And it was a project run by the University of West London and Boots, the chemist, pharmacist, whatever they call themselves these days, who have always been associated with the public good. How many people knew they ran library services, for example? Anyway, they also have a fantastic archive, a lot of content relating to their brand products over the decades. And they wanted to see whether this multi-sensory approach could help people living with dementia. And they worked with a range of care homes. And one case in particular springs to mind. where a gentleman had come in after the loss of his wife and increasingly the loss of his memory. And he came in with some photographs of when he met his wife and could tell the story and could just about connect with his care group, his children and grandchildren. And the staff were able to help him keep connected. But over time, that photograph wasn't powerful enough on its own to connect him. And he gradually lost that thread and wouldn't really speak to anyone, became non-responsive, would sit there day after day and not say a word to anybody. And no one knew how to reach him. So with this project in mind, we decided to put in that multi-sensory prompt. And from his own stories and his family's recollection, we tried to create, using a sensory approach, the day he met his wife. It was one of those flashbulb memories where he would tell people the night he went to the dance hall, the perfume she was wearing, the aftershave he put on, the sounds. So we recreated that and we brought in some of the music and played it. And then we had a series of swatches that Boots had recreated of all the scents and perfumes of the day. And that sort of swatch test. And there was one where he just caught the scent. He said, "Oh, that's Doris's perfume. I remember that. And this is the song we were dancing to." He was out of his chair and he was parading around and he was having the whale of a time. And then we looked at the photographs and he could tell us exactly what was going on and he recognized people and he was back in the present. Now that could be seen as a flash in the pan, but by rehearsing and creating more flashbulb memories, he reconnected with his timeline and led a different quality of life. And that's about the dignity. We need to take those steps now, not just for something to pass on to future generations, but to help ourselves with our well-being. We do our research because we love it. We often look over our shoulders. We need to think of ourselves and play that forward. Really powerful stuff. So finally, to pull together all of these threads, what will the future be in the digital age? Well, it's going to be connected, isn't it? We're going to see more platforms and it's going to connect things. But we need to make those connections too. Not just with the records, but with each other, with groups. To support archives by volunteering our services, a number of archives now rely on groups coming in and running their help desks. So interesting to connect in that way. And that also makes us more collaborative. Collaborating amongst ourselves, with other groups, this sort of rather artificial divide between family and local and community groups and projects. We're more powerful together. And that collaboration extends into other sectors like higher education. And I think as we do really well here and in similar groups, be community focused, giving back and showing the value of what we do. And that allows us, I think, to be caring. Caring for each other, caring for our memories, and of course, caring for the future of the past in this increasingly uncertain digital age. Thank you very much.
Wow. How about that? What an astonishingly inspiring and thought-provoking talk. I don't think I've ever come to a History Society event and made so many notes. Who would like to ask a question? First question.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
If someone can tell me the cure for this cough, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Have you seen any examples of platforms like Ancestry or anyone else trying to create exclusive monopolistic control of what would otherwise be public good data? Or are they just trying to commercialize it while acknowledging that this is effectively public data and it doesn't belong to anyone?
So there's the interesting thing, because usually when you sign a deal for a major data set, you're putting in a large upfront investment to create the digital images and, really importantly, the metadata that allows the algorithms to match the image to the description to what you're searching for, millions of pounds. So they need to protect that. And so there is always a commercial exclusivity for a certain period, 3-5 years or so, after which it is seen to be economically viable for other parties to get access to that data. So in one sense, no, but you still have to pay your subscription to get access to it. And there was a project a few years ago which was called the Digital Panopticon. And it was in the early days of the commercial data sets. And the idea was that a series of teams from higher education would pool together, building on the Old Bailey Online and some of the Find My Past collections of criminal registers and transportation records and prison hulks on the Thames, to create flow-through lives of many of those convicted felons, from capture to assize records to Old Bailey, etc., so that you can connect their journeys into, let's say, Australia, and then once they were there. Lovely project. The idea being that because it was public funded, we'd all get free access. We stumbled up against the problem that many of those data sets were commercially privileged, certainly for an extended period, because of the deal struck by the archives, who therefore need the money to keep their services open. So I wouldn't say it's a deliberate attempt to monopolise or close down access, but as we know, we are paying money for the tools and the access, but also increasingly to upload our content, which then creates their economic model. So I'd say it's less about closed commercial access to data sets. It's more about how our content is being commercialized and is part of that model. So it's kind of a yes but answer to the question.
I'd like to ask another question. Simon, Wendy. Oh, sorry, this is okay.
You were talking about the cuts that are linked to budgets, obviously feeding through to the cutting the population of your colleagues, let's say, in the broadest sense. How is that looking for the future? Is that going to carry on, or is it sort of settled in as much as one can say, or what?
It's going to look grim, to be quite blunt. We're living through very difficult times. There is no public funding, and we're seeing those gaps in the public services increasing. So once again, there will need to be prioritisation. I'm sure there are others here who have had first-hand experience of what those cuts look like, and it is very painful. And that is why we are having to think about different collaborations. So the Hampshire Genealogical Society now runs a lot of the search rooms for the Hampshire Archives. Gloucester does the same. And they've found that that's really vibrant. And whilst I'm not saying that these financial challenges are helpful, they've required a different sort of thinking about how to create a public service. So much more volunteer time, so that the professionalism of archivists and librarians can be focused on where their real benefit and value lies. And so I think it is going to be much more of a partnership, community-driven model. Now that comes with some awkwardness, and we still have to look at the physical infrastructure and the cost of running buildings, and this increased digital expectation of stuff on demand for free yesterday, which comes with the shift in access. But I would really love to give you an optimistic answer, but I think there's a lot of pain ahead for public services. We're seeing many councils technically bankrupt, and that means they will just have to stop services. Not dull them down, but just stop services. And several answers. We've talked about volunteering, but you still need to run the infrastructure. Or does it go into private hands, which then will get commercialised? So that leads us to some different conversations around who has access to our tax-paid state archives and things. So I don't think there are any easy answers. And that's, again, why we need to demonstrate our value. Surrey History Centre is an interesting organisation where they've faced terrible cuts, but they've really shown the value of having people come in. Ryde Social Heritage Group, they're bringing money into the economy by working in partnership with libraries and archives to show that the value is more than just access to, it's what you do with that access that's important. So there's something there I think we can play a part in too.
Any other questions? If not, I've got a question, which is, Nick, what would you say are the 2 or 3 pieces of advice you would give us? I mean, for years you've been kind of Mr. Family History. What are the 2 or 3 pieces of advice you would give to, there's probably 60 family historians here, in the light of all the technology that's now available? You were mentioning some MyHeritage tools, which I didn't know about, for instance.
The first piece of advice is trust your instincts, and that your research methodology is what will get you the best results. Now, I use search engines all the time, but what I do is look at the data I extract and see what that data tells me about the people or the places or the period that allows me to go back into the archives and ask those deeper questions, and possibly to collaborate with people if I can't get to those archives. One of the revelations about my grandmother's story is that she wasn't descended from the Mayflower. It was actually someone who'd come across to America in 1911 on the SS Barbarossa, from Germany. So now I'm trying to find out more about the history of Freiburg and the sort of local industries and stuff there. So stick to your instincts. If we've been doing this long enough, we will know true methodology. Secondly, use the digital platforms, but use them with purpose and with understanding. Like I said, I share stuff online, but I do so not because I want to keep a safe place for all of my stuff, but because I want to collaborate with people. I might put a photograph up and say, does anyone recognize this, and see what comes back. And the third is that sense of playing it forward. And I've always been struck by that comment, self-indulgent navel-gazing, and I use it a lot in my talks, because somehow it's both demeaning to what we do. It was intended as a bit of a slur. But the more I think about it in recent years, actually, there's something quite powerful about that. Self-indulgent, well, maybe, but it is about us. It's about where we live and who we are and our identities and how we use that. Navel-gazing, it sounds as though it's about being introspective and reflective. That's a good thing, surely. Our stories, connected with other people, build communities. Our understanding of our recent and possibly more distant family history gives us a sense of identity and choice. So actually, I think there is something about starting with ourselves and looking at our role, whether it's family, local or community or social history, whatever. Think of that purpose. It does matter. We do have stories to tell. One of my daughters came up to me and wanted advice about a history project. I thought, great, she's worked out, I'm a historian, fantastic. And she genuinely said to me, so Dad, can you tell me from your experience what it was like in the First World War? So I couldn't give her that experience. When she got to the Second World War in the curriculum, I pointed towards my mum, a little twinkle in my eye there, who was born in 1938, and can remember the Blitz, and told my daughter all about those experiences. Now, to her, that's just her lived experience. It was natural growing up during the war, but to my daughter, it was amazing. Picking up bits of shrapnel and that terrifying run down to the bomb shelter, all of those sorts of things. And when she was evacuated, now a couple of years ago, we went back to that place, and she was asking so many questions, and it, I don't know, created a real special bond. It matters that it's personal.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Nick. That's been tremendously inspiring talk and the questions and so on.